Good afternoon, my name's Jinty Rorke, and this afternoon I'm talking to Alan Bellamy of Tauranga. We're in Seymour Place, and this is the house that Alan has lived in for the last 20 years.
G'day, Jinty. How you doing?
Oh, nice
Good to see you. See on now.
Right, Alan, would you like to start off by telling me something about your early family life? Where were you born and brought up?
I was born in Christchurch in 1923 and brought up in Christchurch. I had a pretty happy childhood. My parents had a motor car right from the time I was born, and there wasn't many cars around in those days. And we every weekend we used to love fishing. We used to go out fishing. Went to and pioneered going into resorts that are quite commonplace, but in those days no one else had ever been there, and it was a really interesting time, really, to grow up and to be able to do these sort of things without being crowded out by other people.
And do you have brothers and sisters?
I've got one sister, but she's passed on now.
Was she older or younger than you?
She was older than I was.
And she was obviously part of the family expeditions, was she?
Oh yes, there was that, and it was always my uncle and my auntie. We sort of went as two couples to, and plus Nola, is my sister's name, and myself, and we were the carload that went out. It was quite interesting, really.
Did you go to school in Christchurch?
Yes, I went to school in Christchurch. I went to the Summerfield School and to the normal school, which was in town, that one. There was Summerfield School was in the suburbs and the normal school was in the town.
And how old were you when you left school?
Must have been 17.
So what qualification did you leave with?
I just left in those days with public service entrance examination, which was similar to school certificate today.
And was working for the railways always your first choice of career? Did you always know that was what you were going to do?
No, it wasn't actually. I'd always been interested in motor cars, and my father was in the motor business, and I naturally thought that that's the sort of thing that I'd do. I'd go into the motor business, although I didn't necessarily want to work with my father and that sort of thing. But next door but one to me, one of our neighbours, was the district traffic manager of the railways in Christchurch, and he told me one day about the railways, and that's the top man, of course, in Canterbury, and he told me that there was a vacancy there in the railways, and if I liked to apply for it I could get it, which I did do. That's our car. It was a rugby, and on the running board was my mother and father, and my sister and myself. I'm the smallest one. And that's taken out on a safari, should we say, in the country in Canterbury. That's a photograph taken at Selwyn Huts, that's out in Canterbury on the Selwyn River, and that was one of our weekend occupations, fishing, or trout fishing actually, in that particular spot there. We used to go other places, of course. We would be getting herrings and stuff like that, but that was a trout fishing river.
Did you catch many?
Yes, we were. Well, but you must remember there wasn't many people fishing in those days.
Not like now.
Not like now, and there was plenty of fish around. That's the house at 58 Bletsoe Avenue, Spraydon in Christchurch. I was born in that house. That was Mum and Dad's house, and I lived there until I left home when I was 18 years of age.
Right.
That's my mother and father on their wedding day, Charlie Bellamy and Louisa Bellamy. That's a photograph of my father's business in Victoria Street in Christchurch, and as I say, he did lots of metal work for trucks and buses, and fixed up the springs on motor cars and anything that was dealing with the metal work. And he also made items such as a firewood conveyor, which were not common in those days. I mean, you just couldn't go and buy them like you can today. They all had to be handmade. That's a photograph of the firewood conveyor that my father made. As I say, in those days you just couldn't go in and buy things like you can today. Everything had to be handmade. That's the Summerfield School when I was going there. It's in the south of Christchurch, suburban school. It's still going. And although I think that building is gone now because it became an earthquake risk.
So tell me about your career when you started in the railways. Let's go back to
Well,
that.
I started off at a station called Papanui, which is in the north of Christchurch. And I learnt general station work. I was a cadet, of course, on a 5-year cadetship at that period. And from there I went into the Christchurch station. That was the old place, rambling place it was. And there I worked in the parcels office. The job there was to label all the parcels that were going out. In those days, of course, there was nothing. It was the war period, and there was no petrol or anything like that, and everything went by train. All the little parcels, bread and milk or anything at all. So there was just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of parcels every afternoon. Used to come in to catch all the trains that were going out to the various parts of Canterbury, like Little River, Southbridge, Ashburton, Springfield, Waikari and Rangiora, all those places. And it was a fairly big job actually, doing all that work. Everything came in at the last minute and the trains were waiting to go away and you get all these labels made. Yeah, I stayed there until I went into the army. Well, no, I went into the luggage office, which is just next door to the parcels office, and there I dealt with the lost property and some claims work, and also left luggage and checked luggage.
You had no ambition to be a train driver?
No, I didn't actually. No, it was just the way things went, and I was quite happy doing what I was doing. And I stayed there until I was called up in the army. And then I went into the army, and I've got a photograph of the army if you want it. That photograph was taken when I was in the army in the Signal Corps at Burnham Camp, which is about 18 miles south of Christchurch. It was the main South Island camp in those days for the army. And that's where I did my basic training.
How old were you then?
18.
Did you serve overseas afterwards?
No, I had an illness actually, and I got boarded out of the army. I was in hospital for about 6 months at Hanmer Springs. And anyway, I was going to actually, had already signed up to be a wireless operator air gunner because I'm a qualified wireless operator and with the Morse code. And anyway, I passed to go in as a wireless operator air gunner, and while I was waiting to enter the Air Force, I had this illness and at Burnham. I was at Burnham and I got taken to the Christchurch Hospital. And from there I went to Hanmer Springs, which was the army hospital in those days. It wasn't the alcoholics like it is today. That's a photograph of some of the soldiers at the camp, well, it was the hospital in Hanmer Springs, in the hot water baths that were there, which were therapeutic, which we went in every day, even though there was snow on the ground. Right around the pool there'd be heavy snow, but we still went in every day, and it was hot, of course. That's me on the second from the far right.
Let's pick up the story of your life again when you came out of the army. What happened then?
Well, of course it was the wartime, and people had to do the jobs. They were manpowered to whatever they were, well, not the army, but the government instructed at the time. But being a railway person, they put me back on the railways, but they put me into Burnham Camp again. And I worked at Burnham as a shift clerk, and it involved a 24-hour days round the clock job. And I lived in a little hut alongside the railway line, And I ate in all my meals was attached to one of the sergeant's messes in the camp. And so I had all my meals and everything else in the camp. And I worked at Burnham then for till after VJ Day. Because at that stage, of course, Burnham was the main camp in the South Island and the main supply depot, and there was over 10,000 people in that camp at that particular time. And the station where I worked was very busy. There was only the three of us there for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And because we used to have all the leave trains at the week, Friday nights and Saturdays and Sundays, and they were always with over 1,000 passengers on them, the people coming out to see their family and that sort of that were in the camp there. But it was a very interesting job there because we, knew when people were going away overseas and all the equipment and so forth used to have to go there. It was all strictly confidential, of course, hush of what went on there during the war period. But I was attached, really, although I was working for the railways, I was still sort of half-by with the army at that time. Well, after Burnham, for a wee while I was still attached to Burnham, but I did a bit of relief work over on the west coast in Greymouth and at a place called Kirwee, which is in Canterbury. And then I got transferred to Wellington to the staff training section. In the railways we had controlling officers examinations to pass. There was actually 9 examinations in those days, and I'd done fairly well with my examinations, and I was actually given the job then in the head office, or the staff training section, where we marked all the correspondence lessons because they learnt it all by correspondence, and I did that in Wellington for a couple of years, and then I got transferred into the library, the railways library in the information section. I went to the library school and got a certificate there with the National Library Service as a departmental librarian, and that was a very interesting job. I probably gave me the background to be able to do research and to learn things that have helped me in subsequent years.
And is this how you managed to get your own personal railway library?
Well, of course, it's been built up over the last 50 years, but how it started off was when I went to the library school, one of our jobs was to work in Parliament buildings in the Public Parliamentary Library, Mr. Training, and when I was there, I went down in the dungeons that were down there underneath Parliament buildings, and if anyone got down there, of course, they'd be like Guy Fawkes, I suppose, and blow the place up. But I went down there and had a look at what was down there, and I saw thousands and thousands of these government papers. They were all piles and piles of them. And I looked at some of them there and I could see a lot of interesting stuff, and I wondered who they belonged to. And I found out that they belonged to the government printer. And anyway, fortunately, the chief accountant of the government printer was a friend of mine, and I asked him about it, how I could get hold of them, and he said, well, you can have all those if you'd like to sort them out at the price that they're on them. Now, some of them they're all published from the 1870s on, and you get a big thick one for sixpence, a big thick paper for sixpence. They all had the prices on them, and some didn't have the prices on at all, but most of them did. And I bought them, and I know in those days it cost me quite a few pounds, but it was certainly well worth it because I've never stopped using them.
You had an unfair advantage over everybody else.
Well, I happened to find them. They've been there since 1870s.
When did you get married, Alan?
In 1950, in Christchurch. And Joan was the wife. And
where did you meet her?
Well, actually, that's very interesting. I met her, actually, her father used to work in the railways, and he taught me my photography. And I met her at his place when he took me around there to show me how to do photography, develop film and so forth. I was married in Christchurch and shifted down from Wellington at that stage, and I took up position at the Woolston Railway Station, which was a suburban station on the Christchurch-Lyttelton line. It was a very busy freight station. There was some Andersons had a big foundry there, and the Davis Gelatine Works was there, and the Reed Rubber Works, and there was just all the big factories were around in Woolston. And it was a very busy place because in those days there was no rail ferries, and there was very limited space on the inter-island ferries for freight, and it was an absolute effort to get traffic to the North Island from Woolston. And that was one of the jobs, was to get so many cubic feet, and when a ship came in, a coaster came in, so they could get their goods away. And I remember one day there was a ship came into Lyttelton, and there was a strike on, and it was loaded with bananas. And anyway, they finally got the bananas unloaded, but most of them were rotten, and there was a whole trainload of rotten bananas, and they had nowhere to put them but into Woolston. And you could smell bananas for weeks afterwards, and there was everybody and their auntie was down there trying to pinch the bananas out of the wagons. It was just an impossible task because there was rakes of them, and I've never eaten so many bananas in all my life. But anyway, that was just one of the interesting things that happened there. From there I went to Reefton on the west coast, and it was a place where they had trouble getting staff. Staff hated going to Reefton. They didn't like the climate, and it was a workhouse actually. There was a tremendous lot of work there. And anyway, they asked me if I'd go there, and I said, oh, yeah, I was interested to go over to live on the coast because I had worked over there previously in Greymouth, and I think the west coast grows on you after a while. And anyway, I went to Reefton, and we were there for, I bought my own home in Reefton. We were there 7 years, and really, looking back now, that is what gave me my whole background in history in New Zealand. And it happened with an old chap by the name of Phil Salmon, and he said to me one day, he said, I'll take you out, we'll do some gold panning. And he had told me how he had lived there during the Depression years, and he said he never went hungry, he get enough gold that he used to get there to feed him. And anyway, he took me around to a place called Capelston, which is around out from Cronin into the Victoria Ranges. And it was quite interesting. It's the first time I'd ever seen a ghost town. And he explained to me how, he could remember when there was the hotel was here, and there was a school there and a church there, and he said Bill Brown lived in this house. There was a house, it wasn't there now, the house, but he lived there. And you could see all the daffodils. It was springtime, and the daffodils were growing in the gardens where they had. And it was from then on that he told me there's a lot of other places like that around Reefton, and he said it had a great history, because at that stage I knew nothing of its history. And anyway, I had then sort of delved into the history of Reefton. And one day he said to me, he said, he said, they're going to pull down the old Herald office. That was the paper, the Inganingu Herald. It had been published from about 1874 to 1938. And the building was still there, of course. And he said it was on the main street, on the Broadway in Reefton. And anyway, he said, I think we should have a look in that building before they pull it down. And so we went down there one day and had a look in there. We went upstairs and we found a complete set of all the newspapers from 1874 to 1938 in there, and there was no other copies in existence. There was none. There was none in the Toowoomba Library anywhere. And anyway, we took them home. It took us days to get them all down to this garage. And we took them down to the garage, and we sorted them all up. And anyway, there was nothing in Reefton, of course, or anywhere, even Greymouth, they had nowhere to take them. The only place that had a museum in those days was Hokitika. And we actually got them and sent them to Hokitika. And I know I've read since where they were the only copies and that they'd all been microfilmed and so forth. And that gave me a sense of the importance of newspapers in history, and it's never left me from that date. And not only that, of course, whenever I lived anywhere subsequently, I've always wanted to know the history of the area where I've lived, and started me right off there. So I've got a lot to thank Reefton for. Family were born there, and I really loved the place. It was a very busy job. A tremendous lot of coal used to come out of there, and they had a little private railway line there, and I'm being interested in trains and so forth. I sort of poked around there and found all sorts of relics and so forth. And anyway, the time came, of course, when I had to shift, and I then went to Napier and shifted to Napier.
What was Reefton's function as a railway station?
Well, actually, Reefton, of course, taking the name, Reefton, as a reef, it was the gold reef. It was originally a gold mining place. But gold mining, of course, gradually died up to the Second World War, start of the Second World War. And coal had started to take over because there's just millions of tonnes of coal in that area. And anyway, it actually had coal that was used in automatic grates for factories. It was one of the main functions of the coal that was taken from there. Although it was beautiful household coal. I mean, the coal in the North Island, you can't even compare it with the Reefton coal. In fact, you wouldn't even burn they used to dump all the coal like that they have in the North Island. In Reefton, never used it. The photograph you can see there of the little engine, that's the Barclay engine that was owned by the Mines Department that ran on a private line from Reefton Station out to Burks Creek, about 4 miles, I suppose, 4 or 5 miles. And it used to come in every lunch hour with a whole rake of loaded coal and pick up all the empties to load for the afternoon and the next morning, and used to pick them up at the yard. And that's the actual locomotive depot. The engine on the right is the engines that were used on the mainline trains. They were all old engines. They were all the cast-offs from the rest of the country, principally because they had very good coal at Reefton and they could steam, whereas in the North Island they wouldn't steam too well at all. So that's why we had all the old crocks, but they still did a good job. That's Reefton Station where I worked. It was quite a large station because there was a big staff there. There was the guards there and the shunters, and there was the engines stationed at Reefton because Reefton was at the foot of a very steep grade, what they call up the Tawai bank, and the trains used to be always banked. In other words, they had an engine used to get up behind the loads and push them up over the hill and then come back again to Reefton. Light engine.
What was your position in Reefton?
I was a shift clerk there too. There was 2 shift clerks there. There was a booking clerk and a goods clerk and a station clerk and so forth. But my job was to signal all the trains in and out and to check the engine crews for their train advices so they knew what trains were running, and also used to wabble up all the coal and do all the returns for the station. And in other words, you're a jack of all trades, and it was an interesting job, very interesting job. That is a rail car that was at Reefton. It actually was in 1956, if I remember correctly. And that was when the Springbok tour was on, and the Springboks were on their way through to Westport to play Buller, and they stopped for a short time at Reefton. And it was 1956, the 23rd of July 1956. The rail car is a Vulcan rail car, and it was the rail cars that we used every day on the run between Greymouth and Westport. Reefton was actually halfway, 50 miles from Greymouth, 50 miles from Westport, and we used to have 2 each way daily of those rail cars in those days. They were well patronised, and in fact they were doubled units in the peak periods, holiday weekends and things like that.
Did you do any work in other places than Reefton when you were on the coast?
Yes, well, as I said, I originally was in Greymouth, but I also worked as an acting station master in Angahua, and I spent a short time down at Ekamatu when the station master was away there. So I know the coast.
So where did you go to when you left the coast?
I went to Napier. I was appointed as train control operator at Napier, And my job there was to control the trains from Woodville through to Gisborne. That covered the area right through Waipakarea, Hastings, Napier, Wairoa to Gisborne. 243 miles of single track railway. Particularly north of Napier was quite a trying job really, because there was no staff anywhere except at Wairoa, and so once the trains left, and we used to call that the buoy, they used to get up there and they could easily get lost. You had to wait till they come up on the telephone to tell you where they were. A train control operator is a pretty important position. You have a big graph sheet in front of you, it's quite big, and it's got all the stations along it, and it's all in timed across, and you actually plot your trains, because being single track you've got to work out where they're going to cross, and you've also got to keep a strict eye on the length of the train, because each crossing length's a different length, and you know you're getting the trains too big and they can't cross. You've got to know the tonnages of each train, so that you'll know how the engine's going to perform. If he's full load, he's going to struggle up the hills, because there's very steep hills up in the north line, north of Napier, and if you had to change the crossings of the trains, it was what we call single line automatic up there. You used to have to make out a crossing order, and there was a strict rule there that you always gave the crossing order to the station to the train that's going to stop short, and he has to get the crossing order and acknowledge it before you issue the other one, to give the other chap the authority to come down in front of him. The other thing that was important there was when signals failed, and you used to have to make out what we called a Miss 59. That was an authority to pass a signal at stop. So in other words, of course, a train could be in a section that put signals at stop. So you had to make sure that you knew where every train was, and that before you could issue what we call a Miss 59, and so that they could pass the signal in the stop position. From there, I went to the next office, which really was the wagon supply office. And I used to relieve in there because in certain parts of the season with the stock traffic and that, it was always very busy, and one of the train controllers used to have to go in there to relieve. And I did that for a couple of years, relieving during the busy season. And then they pointed me into that position, and I was then in the wagon supply office at Napier for quite a number of years, which was an important position, because you had to move the tonnage each day, and you have to know what each train will take, and you had to allocate the tonnage out and make sure that all the important wagons went away. Then you had to arrange the engines. In other words, if you had too much tonnage for a particular train, you have to make sure you got another engine. In other words, you had two engines on, and to help it. And with steam engines, of course, in those days it was all steam. You had to watch also about the water. The steam engine has to take water, and you've got to make sure that they get to their tanks where the water is so they didn't have to stop and drop their fire, because if they ran out of water, of course they've got to drop the fire, otherwise the boiler would explode. So it was quite an important job, and I really liked that work. And I relieved in the train controls at the weekends and things like that still, or if someone was off sick, I'd go in there. Then, in about 1966, I was appointed the station master at Ahuriri. Ahuriri is the port for Napier, and that was another interesting position, because you had all the port traffic, and that was another job I did in the wagon supply also, was to arrange all the frozen meat, getting down to the wharf, and being put in, it had to be all sorted up for lockers and hatches and so forth. There was quite a lot involved in it. And I sat there for a couple of, about 12 months at Station Master at Ahuru, and then they sent me back to Napier again into the wagon supply, because they felt that I should be doing that work there again, and so I did that until I got transferred in 1977 to the position of wagon supply officer at Hamilton, and I then went over to Hamilton, and I relieved there. Well, I didn't relieve there, I had the job there for about 5 months, I suppose. That was an important job because again you had the Tauranga marshalling yard there, which my first job every morning was to walk around the marshalling yard at Tauranga to see what was around the place and sort of arrange movement of tonnage for the mills at Kinleith and getting the wagons over for Kawerau and places like that. And then
well, let's take a break here and have a look at some of your photographs of Napier.
Right. Napier. That's the Napier railway yards. The railways, you'll see the engine shed in the background there on the left, and the station is in about the upper right side of the station. It was on a curve. That's all gone today. There's nothing there at all. Everything's now at Ahuriri. The engine sheds are gone, and that land is all going to be redeveloped. They put in the big yards at Ahuriri. The station's been pulled down and everything else. But that was the place where I worked. That was the station at Ahuriri. There's a station and a goods shed there. Again, it was very busy because it was all industry around there. The wool and big wool sheds, and Rothman's factory was right over the road, and there was steel was handled down there. All the petrol tanks were down there, and we had also had all the freezing works. All the wagons had to be cleaned there. We had a cleaning station for the wagons for the frozen meat. So overall, there was quite a good staff here too, actually, shunting staff. Although the engine crews and the shunting staff were actually based at Napier, but they came down every day. And then there was a wharf, another shunt, went down and took all the wagons down to the wharf and sorted them all up for the ships.
Did you continue your interest in history when you were in Napier?
Yes, I went to Napier, knew nothing about it, of course, and I joined the Historical Society, the first time I'd belonged to an Historical Society, because there was none on the West Coast. And I found out again that what an interesting history that Napier had. And anyway, it also it helped me in many ways in the fact that I was thrown into a job, when you're not least expected, to do something that I'd never done before. And that was, first of all, write a couple of chapters for a book on the story of Napier. And also, because I could do photography, I was given the job of finding all the photographs for the magazine, or not the magazine, for the book, and copying them, because they all had to be copied, and doing the prints.
Let's have a look at the book.
And this is the book here, The Story of Napier. It was by Dr. Campbell. And I wrote the book on the transport side of it, in here. I did the photographs, as I said, and sorted them all out, and then I was given the job then of laying the book out, something that I'd never done in my life before. And anyway, I sort of struggled along and did the job, and the book won one of the prizes one year at the time for one of the best history books there were, and that was done by a real amateur as far as the layout and so forth was concerned. But it really did give me a great background on how to do it, because I worked with a printer, learned all the things that you're supposed to know about printing, and it's never left me. And it's been helpful since then. I also did all the photographic work for this book here by Jim Munro. He was the head of the museum at the time, and him and his wife did this Taste of New Zealand recipes, and there's some beautiful photographs that we got out of the I'll call it the archives in Napier. It was from actually the Tauranga, the Napier Museum, and they put recipes to the photographs, and I sort of did all the photographic work. I also at the same time wrote a book on a booklet really, about 70 pages, on the Napier to Gisborne Railway, and also a small booklet on the Napier Waikuhau Railway. That again was good, because it allowed me to do research and find out where things were and so forth.
We've heard a lot about your professional life and your interests, but what was happening to your family all this time?
Well, that's a photograph there of my family. On the left is my son Darryl. He's now executive operations director, at least, of Stagecoach, which is a big Scottish company who run the buses in Wellington, and they've got about 90 in Auckland. So there's about 400 buses that he's actually responsible for. There's my wife, Joan, of course, and sitting there is Gillian. She's married and lives in Hamilton. And then there's myself, and then on the far right is my daughter Mary, and she lives married in Tauranga and lives in Tua. That's a photograph of the Te Rapa Marsing Yards. I used to walk there, down there every morning, used to at 7:30 in the morning and see what wagons were around the place and where I was required to go to different places in the Waikato. It was a hump yard, in other words, it had a hump in it and the wagons went down by gravity and sorted. Supposed to be the best system that you could have, and I thought it was a dead loss. And I wrote and told them that, and finally they've done away with it after spending millions on building it in there. And, so that was the Te Rapa yard.
Well, if my dates are right, you must be just about to arrive in Tauranga.
That's right, I arrived here in 1977. And I was appointed to the area traffic manager in Tauranga, and my job here was in charge of the railways from Waihi, the line was still to Waihi in those days, right through to Taniatua, Mount Maunganui branch and the Murupara line, and also had dealings with the truck services to Potiki and Whakatane and to Gisborne. Later on it changed, of course, when they closed the line from Waihi. They opened the Kaimai Tunnel, and the opening day of the Kaimai Tunnel was, I can always remember it because it was my job to arrange everything here in Tauranga for the reception with the Prime Minister, Mr Muldoon, and it was a showery day, and we had everything set out on the strand, the seats and so forth. Anyway, I had to make a final decision just a few minutes before he arrived that we'd have to have it indoors. So we had it indoors in a restaurant. It's not there now. And that was, I had a bit of dealings with the opening of the Kaimai Tunnel. I walked in through the tunnel before it was opened, and we had to look at all the refuges for the staff and the lighting and so forth, and it was an interesting job. In fact, the whole of the area here was interesting because it was a very busy place. We had the log trains which from Kawerau to Murupara, or Murupara to Kawerau. We had about 5 of those each day, and then you had all the traffic from the pulp mills coming through to the port at the Mount, and similarly from Kinleith. And so it was interesting.
How much difference did the Kaimai Tunnel make?
Oh, it made a big difference. It actually increased the traffic through the tunnel, and it helped the port here to grow. It was actually originally one of the things, the first things that went through there was a lot of superphosphate. There was a phosphate works at Morrinsville in those days, at Kiwi, and the raw materials always gone through Auckland and been railed down from Auckland down to Morrinsville. But once the Kaimai Tunnel was opened, the ships came into Tauranga and took the superphosphate through to Morrinsville from here. It also, of course, speeded up considerably the traffic from Kinleith because it always used to have to go down through Morrinsville and back through Waihi. But of course now it was able to come straight through the tunnel. And traffic actually grew quite considerably, and I was kept statistics of it for the first 12 months, and it was phenomenal actually, the growth, and the cost actually too was reduced for the consignees and consignors.
So would you say that the transportation solutions in the Bay of Plenty has contributed to the massive growth in the area recently?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Actually, a lot of people don't realise it, of course, but you see, the railway was built to Kinleith and to Murupara and Kawerau for those mills, and that's why the railway was built. They were some of the last lines built in New Zealand, and as I say, the Kaimai Tunnel was specially built to take the traffic, particularly from the Kinleith mills, through to the Mount. And you see it here every day, the log trains that come through loaded up to the gunnels, coming through to the mountain. Of course today with the opening of Sulphur Point, there's a lot more container traffic comes through here now from Auckland area and from all parts of the country really. That photograph was taken on the opening day of the Kaimai Tunnel. Mrs Griffiths is there, unveiled a plaque to Mr Mitchell. Mrs Mitchell's there on the right. And also in the photo, of course, is Mr Muldoon, who was the person who conducted the opening ceremony. And there's Eric Faulkner, of course, who was the mayor at that particular time. That's taken again on the opening day. That's myself talking to Eric Faulkner, who was the mayor. At the time we were waiting for Mr Muldoon to arrive. You can see it was raining there with the umbrellas up.
When did you actually retire?
I retired in 1980.
1980?
Yeah,
and
1980.
Then you were able to indulge your interest in history totally?
Well, yes. Actually, I've done quite a lot of things since I retired, and I was also appointed as the Deputy Chairman of the Port Conciliation Committee at the Wharf, a job that I had for about 8 years, and in the last 2 years I was the Chairman, and the Chairman retired. And that was a very interesting job because there you were trying to conciliate between the union and the employers, the port. So I learned a lot about the port and how it ticked and the side of traffic that was handled and everything else. I also, of course, joined the Tauranga Historical Society, and I started to frequent the Tauranga Public Library. It had a pretty small archive section in those days. In fact, it was only just barely in existence, really. And I remember being in there one day, and Deidre Kent, she was a city councillor at that particular time, asked me if I could do something about the book for Tauranga, and bearing in mind that it was the centennial was only just over a year away. And having had experience with the Napier book, I knew exactly how much work was involved and how much time we had, and I knew that it was just pretty near impossible to do a decent job. But anyway, I agreed to do that. After thinking about it for a while, I said, well, I'll have a go at it anyway, but I certainly got to have a lot of help to do the job. And by that time, Jinty was just starting at the archives. In fact, I don't think she was at the archives when it first mooted. I think Fenella was still there. But then Jinty came, and I got to know Jinty, and really was a good joint effort. We worked pretty hard. And I've never regretted that, because I worked every day, and it gave me then a great background to Tauranga's history. I mean, prior to that I knew very little about it at all. And I think it was, I will say it was the best thing out. And since that day I've never sort of looked back. I've always taken a great interest in history of Tauranga. I've had to give a lot of talks about it. In fact, for quite a long time, Jinty and I used to share. She was asked, or I was asked. Otherwise, we'd never have coped with it, to be quite honest. And I always think of the book. The book came out on the very day. It arrived in the morning when the Governor-General was coming in the afternoon for the centennial. And the council had been waiting, of course, for the book, and they were able to give him a copy of the book on the very day it arrived. So that was rather good.
Let's hold it up, Alan. And
that's the book there, Tauranga, 1982, or 1882, 1982. During my research, of course, I found out a lot of little things about the Fire Brigade. I've always been interested in the Fire Brigade, and I took all the notes, of course, for the Fire Brigade, and when they had their centennial, I did a small booklet on the Tauranga Fire Brigade for them. I also did a book, again, on the railways road services, about all the buses that the railways had operated over the years. And then I was asked a few years later if I would write the history of the fertiliser, Bay of Plenty Cooperative Fertiliser Works. And I think a chap by the name of Max Avery might have been behind that. But anyway, I thought about that, and anyway, yeah, I agreed I'd do it. And I went over there and I worked on that for about 18 months. And I must say that you'd think it perhaps a very dull subject to write on a fertiliser works, but really it wasn't. It was most interesting. History is interesting anyway. Doesn't matter what it's on. I mean, when you get back into what's happened in the past and the reasons for all these things, it really opens your whole mind to the workings of, particularly with the business and so forth. And I found the struggle there was to get this fertiliser works going. And they were lucky. They had a good MP here at the time. Mr. Walsh was the MP. And they had a good ally in Keith Holyoake, the Prime Minister. And in fact, if it hadn't been for those, I don't think we'd have ever got it started, because big business in Auckland was right against it. And they took every step that was possible to stop it from going ahead. So that was quite a big book, and not only that, it taught me something, and not only taught me, but I'm sure it's taught the whole of the fertiliser industry. It had never been recognised that the Bay of Plenty was the first place to have fertiliser, and it always been said it had been made in Auckland. And that was probably correct if you looked at it from what we call the existing fertiliser works. But the fertiliser was first made on White Island, in the Bay of Plenty. They had a lake there with sulphuric acid in it, and they had the sulphur there, and they made fertiliser. And then, of course, also they later on shipped the fertiliser to Sulphur Point, and that's how Sulphur Point got its name again, how important history is. And they had a big fertiliser works built at Sulphur Point. And some photographs of that turned up, of course, in the archives. And so I've been able to use those in the book. And so that's why I called the book First in Fertiliser, because the Bay of Plenty was the first to produce fertiliser. Not the present factory, of course, it wasn't even thought about. But the point is, the Bay of Plenty was the place where it was first made. Not only that, the very interesting thing was in the early 1880s, they were exporting sulphuric acid to Australia from here. And it's only in recent years again that the local fertiliser works has been exporting sulphuric acid.
Tell us about your association with the Tauranga Historical Society.
Well, I started, as I said, when I first came here and went to their meetings, and always took an interest in it, and I wrote up a few articles, of course, for the Historical Society Journal, and then ultimately I was made the president of the society, and I did a bit of editing of the journal for a few years. And then the other thing that I did, and of course really it wasn't with the Historical Society, but really with the archive section, I copied thousands of photographs, of the early photographs that came in, many of them during the period of the centennial celebrations. And I tried to print them as I went, but I just got overwhelmed because there was just thousands of them. And it got to the stage that all I could do was to actually copy the photographs and do make the negatives, of course, and give the negatives to Jinty. And she's now got them all in the archives, and I know they've all been indexed, and we'll hope that one day they'll have that computer system when they'll be able to get them all up and running and available to the general public, because I'm sure there's a big demand for them. I also have been interested in transport all my life, and I was a member of the Chartered Institute of Transport. I'm actually a fellow now, Chartered Transport. That was studying with examinations. There was 12 examinations to pass that over a period of 3 years. And I became a member, and finally I was elected a fellow. I wrote their 25th anniversary history of the Chartered Institute of Transport in New Zealand, and I was awarded in 1985 the Norman Spencer Memorial Medal, which is actually the top honour for the Chartered Institute of Transport in New Zealand. This is the Norman Spencer Memorial Medal. It's the prestigious award given by the Chartered Institute of Transport in New Zealand, and there's only one dished out each year. Bob Owens, for instance, got it about 2 years ago, and the other Tauranga person that's actually received it. But as I say, it's the main award that is given. I became a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Transport really in view of all the work that I did for the Institute. I was on their National Council for must have been nearly 20 years, which took me regularly to Wellington, and again I got to know all the people and top people in transport. And as I say, you've either got to have to be made a fellow, of course, it's you've got to be the general manager of some company, or have actually done a lot for the Institute itself. One thing I should perhaps mention that I always feel proud about that I did was actually to lobby for the rail ferry across the Picton Straits from the Cook Strait from Wellington to Picton. The Railways Department at that time, they had a commission of inquiry that had been set up because the Tamahini was going to come off, and the railways didn't push for a rail ferry at all. They pushed for 3 aircraft of the types of the old Bristol freighters, and they said that would cater for all the traffic, and I knew it was just a lot of rubbish, and I told them so too. And I wrote up a whole story about it. I got a lot of information from overseas, from Japan and the United Kingdom and from Scandinavia on the rail ferries that operated there, and I got that information put before the Commission of Inquiry, and they called the Railways Department back and asked them why they hadn't done anything about it themselves. And actually they found in favour of putting the ferries on, and I always feel I played an important part in that. And
you must have met some very interesting people through these years.
Oh yes, I've met people from all walks of life. I always think the most interesting characters you meet was a chap by the name of Derek Cross. He came from Scotland actually. We always said he was a remittance man, sent out here by his parents. But his only job that they ever knew him to do was to go take train photographs. He used to have an Austin Healey, and it had 2 speeds, flat out and stop. And he used to chase trains all around the country. And I'll never forget him. One night he was staying with me in Reefton, and there was a thunderstorm. And if you've never lived in the West Coast, you don't know what thunderstorms and lightning is. And he was absolutely terrified. I can see him now. He thought the place was going to, because Reefton's in a valley, and the hills are right around, the mountains are right around, and of course the thunder used to bark, and it would go right around, and getting sort of come back again. And but I always looked at him, as I say, as one of the most unforgettable characters I'd ever met. I met people in all walks of life. I know one of the earliest people I worked met at least was which again set me off on an interesting subject, and that was the transport position in Auckland, the urban transport. I always wondered why the Auckland station was where it was, because to me it was a stupid place. And I'll never forget, this is how I was only a young man working in Wellington at the time, and the ex-general manager was on the Railways Tribunal. He was a member of the Tribunal, and the office used to be right next to mine, and he used to always come in and have a chat with me from time to time when I was working in the library. And I said to him one day, I said, who was it that put that station where it was? And I nearly went through the floor, and he said, I was responsible for putting it there. And I was only a young chap, and he'd been the big chief. He'd been the chief engineer of the railways and architect man, and also became general manager. A chap by the name of Eugene Casey. But he was a very nice chap. He got all the plans out for me and explained the whole position to me. And this is a lot of people don't understand it. The Auckland station was put there because it was by the Auckland station over the road is the station hotel. And if you look at the station hotel, next to it there's a blank piece of land. There's nothing there. And the whole idea of the railway was going to go straight off the platforms at Auckland Station, through there, under Queen Street and Karanghaki Road, Wellesley Road, and come out at Morningside. And they did half the job of the Auckland suburban area, but they never finished that because the depression years came on and never did it. And so I then understood why they'd shifted out from Britomart at that stage. Now they want to go back, of course, to Britomart. And if you know history, again, you can understand the matter better. And that's another matter that I've had a lot to do with since I retired, is pushing for the light rail for Auckland. In 1988, they put out a report, my overseas consultants, and I read it, and I was absolutely disgusted with the report. I didn't think it was very well done, although it cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I sat down and wrote a report myself, and there was two other chaps who I didn't know at the time had the same ideas as I had, and anyway, we managed to get the Auckland Regional Authority in those days to at least listen to us. They didn't want to know for a start, but anyway, they decided they would invite us up to address them, and we addressed them at their meeting, and they agreed that they'd hold a sensitivity study on the original report, and that was done, and we were given some input into it, and then we managed to convince them to put in a peer reviewer. And there's another overseas reviewer, and he came back and he found in favour of what we'd already said. And from that, of course, the Auckland Regional Council now has adopted the policy of a light rail for Auckland, and that is still going on. The only thing that's holding it up at the moment is money, where the money's coming from. But that's it's a long story. Oh yes, I have a wider interest in railways. I'm interested in aviation and shipping and anything that deals with transport, basically, and roading, because they're principally all tied up. And anyway, at the present time, I'm on the Western Bay of Plenty sub-regional transportation study, and I've got some ideas about what needs doing around in Tauranga, and I don't always agree with what the council have got in their own mind. For instance, I do feel that there's got to be a comprehensive bus service in Tauranga, and I've worked on that. I've actually put in a report on that recently to the regional council, and I see that they've done something about it there, and been some stupid editorial in the paper, which I've written to the editor and told them what I thought of it. And I don't also agree with what Mr. Pope's been saying. He talks about subsidies, but he as I said before, he'll look at he takes 50% subsidy for every dollar they spend on roading from Transfund, but he won't take 40% of subsidy for a public transport system which is available to them. Also, he talks about user pays when at the moment the ratepayers are subsidising the Durham Street parking building by about $286,000 a year, and that he wants to build Route K with money coming off the Harbour Bridge tolls. And while I'm not against tolls, I think it's one way to do it. Route K, this one that he's talking about at the present time, is actually for the heavy trucks to come from off the Carmice to go to the port or wherever they're going. And why that should be paid for by the users of the bridge, you'll never use the road, I don't know. That to me is not user pays. I think also that they should double the size of the Harbour Bridge as the main aim at the moment. I mean, we've got to see Road J, of course, has got to be built. That's been held up, of course, for reasons we can't blame the council for or for Transit New Zealand, but the fact that the land has been held up getting their hands on it. And but that's got to be built, and I think myself they're doing the wrong thing by widening 15th Avenue. I don't think that's the way to go ahead at the present time. As far as the railway on the Strand is concerned, that's another interesting subject. I had tried at the time when the Harbour Bridge was being built to get the railways to go across at that particular time, but of course the government at the time would spend no money on anything. They were thinking more of how much they could sell. And so nothing was done about it all, even though there was support from the Hamilton people, who in those days controlled a lot of this area. But at the present time, I can't see any way of it being shifted from the Strand because the railways have now been sold, and they're sold to private enterprise, and it's not a commercial proposition to pull the railway out of the Strand and spend millions of dollars to go across a bridge. I mean, the shareholders won't do it, and that's all there is to it. And I'm sure there's nowhere else the money's going to come from. Council won't find the money because we're talking big money. And I think myself it's a pie in the sky trying to think that's going to happen.
Would you like to look back on your life in the railways and tell us what changes you've seen and what your opinion is of the railways now as the railways in its heyday?
Well, when I joined in 1940 there was about 26,000 staff, and today there's about 4.5. The railways, of course, had those days had no competition because there was petrol restrictions were on 1940, and there was just no opposition at all. The railways, in my opinion, did a pretty good job over the years. There was a conscientious staff on the whole, and we did everything basically. And when you come and look back on the railways, a lot of people said, look at all the staff they had compared with what they got today, but they seem to forget a lot of things. First of all, the railway had 5 big workshops, and that was the training ground for apprentices for New Zealand. They took hundreds of apprentices every year. Now, they spent their 5 years training in the workshops, then the biggest majority of them left, of course, and every year there was hundreds taken on. So, in other words, it served a very important social purpose for the country in training craftsmen. The railways, of course, in those days was all steam engines, and steam engines, of course, had to have 2 men on them. They had to have people to load up the coal and clean out fireboxes and everything else. In other words, there was a lot of staff involved. Signalling was another important matter. The railways had a tablet system, and nearly every station had a tablet staff with 2 and 3 shifts. Now, of course, there's no such thing as tablets, all been done away with, different system altogether. And so that again was saving the staff. Then, of course, the computer came in, and the computer just wiped out hundreds and hundreds of jobs because all the labelling and all the work that was done by staff is now done by computers, and it's been a handful. Another important thing that I had to do, and which I haven't mentioned before, was that I helped institute the system of computerised wagon control for the railways. They gave me the job in Napier as a pilot scheme to work, and I worked on it for about 3 years, round the clock actually. So it went 24 hours a day, and the girls used to ring me up at 2:30 in the morning, say the thing had fallen out, and I used to have to go down and at work and try and get the thing going again. And that was a very important thing because that meant that we knew where every wagon was at any minute of the day. And today it's been, of course, expanded in a lot more than was when I was doing it. But we only had it, of course, at that particular time in the Napier area, to work between Woodville and Gisborne. And today, of course, it's nationwide, and I managed to just see it nationwide before I retired in 1980. But as I say, it's been expanded a lot since then. Dieselisation, of course, came in, and that meant, of course, that trains could take bigger loads. Technically, if you had 2 engines on a train, which was steam engines, one could only take, because of the fact there was 2 separate drivers, they were not synchronised, with the result that the second engine could only take 80% of its full capacity, and with a K you could only take 66 2/3 of its capacity. But today, 2 and the diesels will take double whatever it is, and not only that, of course, each diesel takes a greater load than a steam locomotive. Wagons, the railways were very, very slow in changing over to bogie wagons, and while they haven't done it yet, they have today got few what we call 4-wheel wagons. Most of them are bogies now, and that means they got 8 wheels, and they can go much faster. The trains go much faster today than they used to. The railways, of course, have been sold to private enterprise, and at that stage I was never very keen on it, probably having worked for 40 years as a government department, but I think it's the best thing that ever happened. Again, because of the people that have bought it. The Wisconsin Central Railway of the United States are really on the ball. So much so that they bought the British Railways for all their freight services. They're now looking to buy the Australian Railways, and they've extended considerably in America. And they really go ahead. They don't muck about with bureaucrats and so forth that we had to do with Treasury and to get any money at all, and politicians, which I haven't got a very high regard for. As a matter of fact, if the railways hadn't been sold when they would only be half the size they are today, because they are working there to closing up a lot of the railway lines from all the way from south from Christchurch and all the Napier Gisborne line and north of Auckland and everything else. They just didn't know. Well, they were working on the theories of Treasury and Roger Douglas's theories, and which were bankrupt, in my opinion. The railways today are making handsome profits and giving a good return to the shareholders. And no, I think myself that the railways are lucky that they're in the hands of the crowd that have got it. Mind you, things could change if the wrong people got it.
Thank you very much indeed for talking to us today, Alan. It's been most informative and most entertaining. Thank you for giving up your time.
Okay, thank you.
Alan, I realise I've just said thank you very much for all your time, but I noticed on the wall just as we were packing things up that you received the Heritage Award. Perhaps you'd like to tell us about that.
Well, the Heritage Award, of course, was an award that was created during the centennial of the borough in 1982, and it was presented by the City Council in conjunction with the Historical Society, and I presume that I received it for the work that I've done over the years in the preserving Tauranga's heritage, even if it's only in photographs or in words. I feel that's probably there, but I can think of a lot of other people who should have got it before me.
Well, that's your opinion, and I think it was very well deserved.